I mean, you mentioned about Chinese interest in preventing India from getting closer to the other countries. Now, Pranay, I mean, I think before the Chinese foreign minister came, the government has announced the visit to Japan. At a time when China-Japan tensions are a bit quite hostile to each other, do you think India has got the flexibility to engage both?
Raja, if we see, I mean, if we put India, China, and Japan in that context, we've seen this kind of a maneuvering by the three, or the two, I would say, going on for the last 10 years. If you remember, when Xiaobao was supposed to come here for the strategic partnership, you found the Japanese Prime Minister coming here and started signing a similar agreement with India. When our Prime Minister, I mean the former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was to go to Japan, you had just before that Premier Li Keqiang coming here. So this will go on, I mean between the two, the kind of relations that Japan and China have, there will be a bit of reflection on the way it pans with India, the relation. That is there. But our relation with China, one will be at the bilateral level, definitely. But it's also at a regional level and also at a global level. So those factors, the development that take place, I don't think we can be immune to that. And accordingly, we should have the flexibility, to change or move accordingly.
China with the Americans as well. I mean, I think US-China relationship have not been in good shape. And there's some sense, occasionally you hear the Chinese saying, look, sometimes expressing concern about India-US relationship, sometimes saying, look, no, India is very independent, it will never join the United States. Where do you see that context? How does that influence the evolution of India-China relationship now?
Well, I think it always gives us space if we have options vis-a-vis the United States. As Ambassador Suri pointed out earlier, the Chinese are, while they may be sort of happy that we have a clear government here which is decisive and willing to make moves, at the same time, if that government makes moves, say, towards other great powers, which it will do in due course of shaping India's foreign policy, then there will be implications for the Chinese. And the Chinese own position has this schizophrenia, right? On the one hand saying, is India a lapdog of the United States, or is India independent? So they themselves are unable to make up their mind. And I think that's a good position for India to be in. As long as we can keep them guessing, as long as we can let them know that we have many options to exercise, whether it's United States, Japan, with other countries, I think, our hand will be much better in playing with the Chinese.
Nalin, when Chinese do something with Pakistan, I mean, they don't ask for permission. I mean, they've given all kinds of things to Pakistan. Or when they were closer to the Americans than we are ever with the Americans. So, is it that we have to take into account constantly what they think of my relationship with third parties, or we do what's right in our national interests, but making clear to everyone that India has an independent foreign policy?
I'm glad you asked that question, because I think it's been wanting to be asked for a long time. I think we have to be far clearer and act more decisively in our national interests, irrespective of what others may think about it. We've never played the balance of power game very well, as you know. We sort of wait and watch, and then we are shoved in a particular direction and we take a line. That's one way of running foreign policy. But I think if you have to be a great power, and if you want to ensure that the forces that are inimical to you are kept in check, then you have to take certain decisions on your own, which will have downsides for your relationship with some other countries, and you have to be able to accept those costs, and that is a sign of a great power, and that is also a sign of independence of decision making. But I think we should not be seen as whiners. This is a problem. Very often we complain to countries that you're doing this with so and so, but this is not good for us. The answer often is, but you're doing the same thing, so that's not good for them. So I think we have to stop being whiners. We have to take India's interests and put them in prime position, in pole position.
Pursue enlightened self-interest, you say, and manage the costs which come in that process. Pranay, if I might come back to you and look at the bilateral issues. Now, the India-China relationship has been very sensitive to the dynamic in Tibet. I think when things are restive in Tibet, there's tension in India-China relationship. When things are normal in Tibet, things are good between India and China. But now, last few years, certainly since 2008, there's been trouble in Tibet. You see that having an effect on India-China relationship at a time when the Chinese are pretty strongly concerned about, situation in Xinjiang or in Tibet or those kind of separatist issues that they're dealing with.
Raja, in a way, I mean, it's interesting the way they look at Tibet and the way they want to present it to the outsiders. I remember being part of a media team to Tibet, and this was in 2008. We were the last group which were brought in just before the Olympics. We were there in July, and in August they had their thing. And they showed us around, what had happened. They gave us their side of the story. Then we wanted to go, and look around what was happening. There they were a little uncomfortable when we tried to, convince them that you've brought all of us from such a distance, just to show that things are normal, or there were a group which involved in riots and things like that. Let us have our own story. These are some of the things they are still very sensitive about, how the outside world sees it, how much they can really, let go. Should it be conducted, but I think, it's not in the same place. It is moving. It's also a dynamic kind of a thing. Every time there's a trouble, they perhaps take a step back, look at it, take a more rigid position. But then they must be having the internal discussions when they move a little more, that we need to give our side of the story, take people around, show that things are normal. So I think, this will go on for a while, but the sensitivity on Tibet will remain.
I think one of the reasons why Mr. Wang Yi has come here, the Chinese Foreign Minister, is to get the Indian support for the celebration of the 60th anniversary of the Panchsheel Agreement that Nehru and Jawaharlal signed in 1954. Now, all of us, in a sense, the Panchsheel Agreement was about Tibet, about India's relationship with Tibet and the nature of trade across the Indo-Tibetan frontier. Now, while everyone talks about Panchsheel and romanticizes it, is it really relevant today? I think it's one thing for the Chinese to say, because Chinese are saying, look, don't interfere in Tibet. But from the Indian perspective, is Panchsheel so relevant today?
Well, one of the things we must avoid doing, particularly in sort of public discourse, is to create myths about history. And this seems to be a prime example of how an entire mythology is spun about something. As you rightly mentioned, the 1954 agreement, in fact, it's not even called the Panchsheel Agreement. It's called the Treaty for Trade and Transit between India and Tibet. That is what the treaty is about. Panchsheel merely forms a preamble to it. What most people don't recognize, including those who celebrate the Panchsheel Agreement, is that when the treaty came up for renewal in 1960, it was the government of India, under no one other than Jawaharlal Nehru, which refused to renew the treaty. So why are we sort of assuming that, as long as we treat it as a historical event, it is for historians to study it, to understand what India and China were trying to do, how they were trying to build some kind of a via media. It was a project of its time. I think those times have changed, and we must look at it as history rather than mythology today.
Yeah. I think both sides might have observed the principle of non-interference more in breach than in observance. But that brings me to the more complicated question of the territorial dispute, or the boundary dispute between India and China. Of course, it is the Indo-Tibetan frontier, of course. Now, the question is, it's under your watch, when you were the Joint Secretary dealing with China, that the first principles were outlined for the settling the boundary dispute. When Prime Minister Vajpayee went to Beijing in 2003. After that, you went as envoy, saw the initial negotiations move. Now, what began as a determined attempt at resolving the boundary dispute has now moved back to managing the boundary dispute and managing the military tensions that are emerging, for example, in Depsang Valley last year. Now, are we condemned to manage the border, or do you think today we are ready for a more substantive negotiation with them? And more importantly, are the Chinese ready for a settlement on any reasonable terms?
Let me just make one correction. The political parameters and guiding principles for the border solution was signed in April 2005 when Wen Xiaopao came to India. I was ambassador in China that time. Process of negotiations began after the Vajpayee visit. That was the first task with the SRZ and the first part of the 3-part agenda that was given to them, which they have completed. The second part, as you know, is to agree on a framework for a boundary settlement, and third is to actually demarcate the boundary on the ground. I think the answer to your question is that we already have adequate mechanisms to manage the border. Obviously, these mechanisms need to be expanded and are being expanded. That aspect should not be confused with the boundary negotiations. I think the settlement of the boundary will require political decisions at the highest level in both countries. We have the tendency to believe that China is a monolith. China is not a monolith. China also has public opinion, and over years, just as we have entrenched positions, there are entrenched positions in Chinese society and in the Chinese academic community, in the Chinese think tank community. So the question therefore is, what is the right time to come to a political settlement? My own perspective is quite straightforward. I think the parameters and principles which have been agreed to are such that we can actually have a boundary settlement on that basis. The question is, are both sides willing to move in that direction? My own guess is that we have been willing to move in that direction. I'm not so sure on the Chinese side, because frankly, from my, and I've attended and participated in many of these SR talks, my own feeling is that the Chinese have not been forthcoming on this, and they tend to want to renegotiate settled issues all the time. And you will find that now. Now that you have a BJP government in power, you will find a change in the Chinese position. They will tend to favor those aspects which they believe that the NDA favored in the past. So, I think it's not as if this issue cannot be settled. It's a difficult issue, it's a complex issue, it will take time, but we have parameters and guidelines on the basis of which it can be settled.
Thank you. I think we take a break now, and we'll come back for more on China with our very distinguished panel. Stay with us.